Hey there, welcome to the archives. So, before I get into this episode, I wanted to share that I just attended a session called Stop Black Femicide, a UNCSW event. It included presentations from Nneka McGregor, who's the executive director and co founder of Women at the Center. It also included Rosalind Page, who's a founder of Black Femicide US, and Dr. Temitope Adefarakan, who's an anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant, as well as a co-founder of Truth and Transformation. And it included Tara Paul, who's a project manager of Advancing Gender Equity for Black Women, Girls, and Gender Diverse People in Canada, Dr. Gifty Asare, who is a clinical research associate, and Nilmini Rubin, who's the chief of staff and head of global policy for Hedera. So I got to join these incredible women today and listen to a topic that's actually really quite difficult, which is Black femicide. So I missed the first few presentations because I was in another Zoom room, but it was really impactful and also disheartening at the same time. I learned, Dr. Adefarakan taught me that 4 Black women are killed each day in Canada because of femicide. And so for those who don't know, femicide is when a Black woman is killed because of hatred, contempt, pleasure, or a sense of ownership over them, is what Dr. Adefarakan shared. So femicide in general is homicide. So it's when a woman is, homicide is when a person is murdered or killed, right? Femicide, femme, again, women, you learned in the last episode, femme is the French word for women. So femicide is when women and girls are killed specifically because they're female. So they are killed specifically because of a bunch of different reasons. Like I said, contempt. Sometimes in some cases, they might be perceived as bringing dishonor to the family, and so the family decides to kill them. Maybe she rejected a man, so the man decides to take revenge or retaliation and kills her. I've done an episode on femicide and shame before because I think the two are really linked. What's often happening here, and this is not to say that emotions are the only reason. Like I said in the other episode, there's a whole lot of different things that are at play, but I study emotions and shame, and I'm really interested in what shame is the emotion, how it really is. Just the main message is no joke, right? Shame leads to a lot of anger, a lot of aggression, a lot of violence and pettiness, blame, and people will be so wounded, the ego gets so wounded that how dare you either expose me publicly, try to make me feel like a small person, bruise the ego. Just this, when you become ashamed, but you're unable to look at that shame, you blame another person for causing it. And so in anger, in frustration, in misogyny is really what it is, then you then kill a woman for that. And so it's a really difficult process for me a conversation for me to process, mostly because it's in this conversation specifically around femicide, it's Black men in the state that are killing us. Again, don't argue with me on this. I just was listening to the experts tell me this. So Dr. Farrakhan shared 3 specific stories that really drove home the message. So the first was of a Black girl who was found dead in a dumpster this past winter. And she went missing about a year ago, or she was killed about a year ago. She was never reported missing, but she did go missing. There's still no name for her. All we know is that she was about the ages of 3 to 7 years old, and she was wrapped up in blankets and found in a dumpster. It turns out that she was murdered, like I said, a year ago in Toronto. No one knows the circumstances of her death. That is an example of femicide, when you're killing a young Black girl. If you report me, I will kill you. These are the words of Bridget Touchy's ex-boyfriend. That's what he said to her when they broke up. She broke up with him because she was reporting abuse. She went to the police. He was charged. He was put in jail. He was later released from jail. Once he left jail at 4 a.m. in the morning, when she left work, he was at her car waiting for her. He asked her to drop the charges. She said no. And he killed her. He stabbed her to death. She was a Ghanaian woman that lived in Toronto. This was 10 years ago. She was 27 years old, and she left behind 2 kids. The presentation today said that he is 40 now, I believe, and he had in 20 years, so in another 10 years or another 12 years or something, he can petition for parole and might be able to be released. And her mother, who's the grandmother of the kids, is worried that he might, if the kids reject him, he might kill her. This is what I learned today, according to Dr. Farrakhan. The last one was Samaya Palmer, who's a 26-year-old woman. She's a Somali woman, and was last seen being chased around Toronto. In the village. Her body was found in a home. There's no context that was given as to whose home, any of that kind of information. To this day, her death has not been ruled as a homicide, even though she was last seen being chased by a man. She faced transphobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Black racism. And one of the stats I learned today was that the life expectancy of trans women is age 35. So Dr. Gifty said something that I never really thought about in this context. So she studies neuroanatomy, I believe it is, specifically the brain, and Alzheimer's and brain injuries, right? So aging is part of the work that she looks at. And she said it's impossible to study aging when in the Black people when they don't age. Yeah, that really hit home. So I share this to give some sort of context and to remind us of the stakes of this work, right? People will have you believing that feminism is a threat to the Black community. In this context, it's actually Black men that are a threat to the Black family because you're killing Black women, and as well as the state that's killing us too. When I say state here, I mean police officers that are killing us, the judicial system that's failing us, the strong Black women trope that results in the medical industrial complex not believing us when we're in pain or dying. So these are some of the ways in which we are slowly being either literally killed off or dying off. So I want to also add here that white supremacy absolutely plays a role in this, mainly in the erasure of Black and Indigenous femicide, right? So because the media is always focusing specifically on murdered and missing white women, there's often, and in Canada, there's really not a lot of data or research at all that looks at the femicide within Black women. And so, okay, it might not necessarily be like white men or women directly killing these folks, but we have to look at the larger structural systemic issues that's at play that's also not highlighting these issues or making it seem as if it's not something that's real or happening. So, of course, there are so many other factors that play a role, but I'm going to leave that there, okay? So now I'm going to get into the episode, today's episode, which is looking at interventions in the feminist movement from Indigenous, Asian, and queer feminists. So some white feminists will have you believing that Indigenous women were passive recipients of feminism. In actuality, history has shown that pre-contact, so pre-contact means pre-colonialism, before the settlers came here, or into other places like Ghana, for instance, Indigenous women had agency and power in their communities, unlike some white women, some white European women. So Cree Métis professor Kim Anderson wrote, "Where Native women were powerful workers, white women were encouraged to be weak and frail." This is a direct quote. "Where Native women had sexual liberty, white women were restricted from pleasure." And you can find this on page 272 of Anderson's text that was published in 2013. Similarly, Cree Métis researcher and educator Verna St. Dennis and academic Cynthia Stirbys, they argue that Indigenous women that are native to Turtle Island, so again, North America, Central America, they historically occupied positions of power and authority, autonomy, and high status. So if you have watched The Woman King, this was also similar in West African context, where women were also regarded as having some sort of autonomy and high status. And that's not to say that there weren't issues of sexism that was happening, right? But it was just saying that pre-contact, women were actually respected and they were in positions of high power. So Stirbys adds, and this is again a quote, European traders had difficulty dealing with Aboriginal women who in some societies were in charge of furs and whose consent was required before men could complete bargains. Again, I shared this in a previous episode, right? And so the European traders, when the men came here, they realized that, wow, these women actually have a lot of power, and it's them that we actually have to go through. For both St. Denis, and again, there's a lot of different Indigenous First Nations communities, lots of different tribes and nations. So it wasn't specific as to which nations, and I'm not saying that this is across all, because there's no homogenous Indigenous identity, right? Just that there's no homogenous Black or African identity. I need to put that out there. So both St. Denis and Stirbys explained that in many cases, it was Indigenous women who modeled the women's equality that underpins feminism, not their European counterparts, who instead faced subjugation from European men. So, for example, Anderson goes on to point out that matrilineal communities, such as the Iroquois, the Navajo, and the Apache, they actually challenged this myth that white women were the origin of gender equality expressed as feminism. In gender-based analysis and Indigenous worldviews, Cynthia Stirbys reminds us that gender inequality was not a major issue pre-contact because each person, regardless of their gender, was valued and held an important role within the community. This meant men, women, elders, and children. And also remember that there are two-spirit people in these communities as well, too, right? Again, people have you thinking that being queer, non-binary is like a Western import. And I've seen accounts from Hawaiian communities as well as in Native and Indigenous First Nations communities here who did celebrate folks who were gender fluid pre-contact. So while Indigenous women living in matriarchal and egalitarian kinship pre-contact cannot be said to be feminist proper, right? Because again, we learned last episode that feminism came out of France in the 1880s, I believe it was. So it's Indigenous women are not necessarily feminist proper pre-contact because there was no patriarchy per se for them to oppose, right? However, the ideas and the models that they emanated, they were feminist in that sense of how we believe it to be in this day, right? This idea of equality was something that was being practiced. It was something that they were in relationship with, right? Not equality, not just between humans, but between men and women and also the land. So it's important to note here that white feminists or Western feminists, feminism, it merely just gave a name to concepts that were already being enacted by many women globally, right? So in China, feminism was referred to as phenomenology. In the Philippines, it was known as Babaylon Feminism or babaylanism. In a century of women's activism in the Philippines, 1905 to 2006, Mina Roses told us that Babaylon is a traditional priestess that is native to the Philippines and was considered the pre-Hispanic feminist archetype. Again, feminist being here as a convenient term to kind of put a label on the practices and ideologies that was happening pre-contact before the Spanish came to the Philippines. They had women, traditional priestesses, who were already engaging in equality as we know it to be feminism today, right? So Babaylons continue to influence modern-day Filipina feminist activists who have reinvented themselves as modern Babaylons. You can find this on page 42 of Mina's work. The same could be said for some Black American women who lived an Indigenous way of life pre-contact. So in Orishas, goddesses, and voodoo queens, the divine feminine in the African religious traditions, Lily Dorsey, this is a text from 2020, educated us on West African female deities in Benin, Nigeria, and Ghana, Specifically, she was looking at the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Akan traditions, and that have influenced Haitian, Cuban, Brazilian, Trinidadian, New Orleanian, and just a lot of the Black diaspora in general when it comes to traditional African spirituality. So according to Dorsey, some of these women, they included the ancient Nana Baluku, Yemaya, Oshun, Mamiwata, and Oya. These deities represented power that was void of corruption and abuse. Is not to say that they were perfect, right? But she points out that there's a history that Western feminism typically ignores. We don't often talk about Chinese, Indonesian, Filipino, Babaylons when we're talking about feminism, right? This creates a gap in how we understand feminism globally. The introduction of settlers and missionaries is what disrupted a lot of traditional ways of life for Indigenous people within less than a century of contact. Cynthia Stirbys again wrote, and this is a quote, "Missionaries tried to install values of a nuclear family with a husband as the authority and where children and wives are to be disciplined. This contrasted with the values of Aboriginals, extended families, closely knit clans, where individual autonomy was respected and children were sacred." So they are arguing that it was actually settler colonialism and the missionaries coming and having contact with them that disrupted a lot of this, that maybe even created this whole idea for feminism, because they weren't dealing with a lot of the same inequalities as we are now, right? Women did have some sort of authority. So since then, Indigenous women have been written out of North American history and just dominant culture overall. Native, Indigenous, First Nations people, they are often written out of history completely. Just a few years ago, because of the unmarked graves that we found in Canada, that here started the conversation of residential schools. Before that, it was not in our curriculums. A lot of us did not know about this version of Canadian history, right? The First Nations people are always made to disappear, as if they just were not even here in the first place and that they have not existed since then. That's very intentional. Mainstream feminism is unfortunately no exception, right? So Indigenous feminists and scholars such as Verna St. Denis, Cynthia Stirbys, Kim Anderson, they're all challenging this erasure, and they're insisting that Indigenous women's voices be heard as integral. I've seen arguments that, same with Black feminists. Some people will say people don't like the label of feminist because it's so associated with Western feminism. So I've heard accounts of Indigenous women saying we're not feminists. Same with Black women saying we're not feminists, we're womanists. It's not what feminism means per se that they're turning against. It's the term feminism that they reject. Right? So again, it's not to say that they're not advocating for equality and equity for women and girls. It's saying that they're rejecting the term feminism because how it's been conceptualized within a very white, Eurocentric, North American context. So their demands remind us that women in these communities have been resilient for a very long time, and they've been innovative trailblazers. It's just we don't talk about it. Just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean it wasn't happening. So I'm going to move into interventions from Global South. And again, the term is also very contested. Mary Tripp challenges this notion that feminism was solely rooted in Europe and North America. So in the last blog, I talked about some of the countries that were the first countries in their regions to grant women the voting rights. Here, we're going to talk about a different genealogy outside of the continent. So Japan, China, India, Chile, there were women here who were already involved in activism and education around like labor movements, for instance, and that far exceeded that in North America, is what the text said. So for instance, again, Mina Roses points to women's organizing in Asia that dates as far back as the 1920s and 1930s. What the writer identified as homegrown feminism. It's a quote that is signifying a difference from the West, right? So according to her, the diversity of the Asian region did not allow for a quintessential Asian feminism because women's work differed from country to country in Asia. Again, just as Indigenous communities are not a monolith, just like Black communities are not a monolith, same with Asian communities. You can't have a specific Asian woman that's quintessential because the work looked different from country to country. So some white feminists insist that they influence global articulations of feminism, right? Feminism came out of France and moved to North America. We then focused on international globalization, international works of feminism. That was a blog I did on Western feminism. A lot of other feminists are saying, stop that. Stop that. You guys did not influence us per se. We were already doing that. And not only were we doing it, our context was different. It was rooted in nationalism, right? How we were organizing was not necessarily around women's equalities. It was our right to be free from colonizers. It was part of nation building, part of nationalism. Suzanne Blackburn suggests that the emergence of feminism in places like Indonesia was closely connected to nationalism and the fight for independence. This was also true for other Asian countries that were colonized by Europeans, such as Korea, India, and the Philippines. So, for example, in Indonesia, which is the largest Islamic country in the world, they were formerly colonized by the Netherlands. So the first women's group that was formed there was in 1910, and Blackburn notes that these early feminists were mindful of Western feminism and careful not to claim it because the national movements were very suspicious of outside influences from the West. So in places like China, Cambodia, Singapore, and Thailand, there was fear that Western feminism was entirely too radical and a threat to the state and family structures, right? There was this idea that some Asian women activists, they avoided the word feminism altogether because it was associated with like bra burning, white women, individualism. When you come from a collective society and now you're hearing from people in individualistic societies that are endorsing certain things, there's going to be a rejection of that, right? We're more community oriented. So the feminism was associated with individualism. So a lot of people said, no way. They also believed it to be anti-men, right? This idea that feminism is anti-men, it's anti-children, and it's anti-family. A lot of Asian, specifically in this context, Cambodia, Singapore, and Thailand, they didn't want to mess with the word Western feminism. Same in countries like Ghana, for instance, right? Because feminism is seen as a Western import, they see it as anti-family, as very individualistic. There's a lot of resistance to claim feminism, which makes complete sense, right? It's just, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that what it is that we're doing needs to be thrown away. The fight for gender equality is still important, even if we're not using the term feminism. Even if you're opting for womanism or Black feminism, the work still looks very similar, even though it varies and is also different. So there were lively debates around the topic of feminism in Asia, the idea of women's suffrage, women's rights as valid human rights, the importance of reproductive health, self-determination. All of these were heavily influenced by women all over Asia. So to this end, Asian feminists like Pia Chatterjee, Mina Rosses, Mitsuya Yamada, and Merle Wu, they remind us that even in cases where white feminists influence global articulations of feminism, the erasure of these other diversified stories contributed to a less expansive and inclusive version of feminism, right? If we're looking at queer feminists as well too, so Paula Baketa, Audre Lorde, Sarah Ahmed, Sherry Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, Leah Lakshmi Pepsania, Samara Singha, they all remind and bring our attention to lesbians and women who identify on the 2S TLGBTQIA plus spectrum. I saw somebody online recently referring to that as the alphabet community in a derogatory term. But there's a number in there actually. So this also includes those that are at the intersection of race, class, disability, mental illness or wellness, neurodiversity. We have folks like Janet Mock, Vivek Shreya, Jack Haberstam, Eli Clare. They've all asked us to consider how we approach gender variance, trans identities, and those on the gender nonconforming spectrum, same as Laverne Cox. Scholars Dr. Celeste Orr connects feminist queer theory with disability studies and intersex studies as well too, and all of them are asking us to challenge the medical industrial complex and how it orders and essentializes bodies, basically, right? So these accounts that I shared, they're all feminist mobilizations, even if we don't like the word. They are all contributing to theory, resistance movements globally, even when they're marginalized, if not erased entirely, right? So this is a reminder that while mainstream feminism has purported to universal models of solidarity, right? Western feminism saying, oh, we are advocating for all women. Well, actually not really, because you left and continue to leave a lot of women and girls out. And you're really struggling with the gender nonconforming trans folks as well too. So you'll see feminists who are TERFs, right? Trans exclusionary feminists, but then they'll claim to be universal. How are you universal if you're still leaving people out of your movement? And so that's what I wanted to share in this post, is to remind you that there have been different articulations of feminism. Even if we don't like the word feminism, again, the next blog I'll look into Black feminism, which is the bulk of my research, and there have been folks who just like, we don't. Alice Walker. There's a lot of. Speaking of TERFs, but womanism comes from Alice Walker. So, and I was sleeping last night, and another thing I might just say it here publicly is just also a reminder. And I don't know. This is not to defend any. I'm gonna leave it. Actually, I'm not gonna touch it. Until next time, feel free to like, subscribe, or share. I'm gonna end it here. Okay, in solidarity. Just have a good day. Bye.